In lesson 9-4, we're going to be moving on to solving quadratic equations. And you started talking about solving them when we were talking about the discriminant in lesson 9-8. So you need to get used to hearing this all the time. You're basically, when you're solving, you're finding when y equals 0, which is your x-intercepts, and we've talked about that. It can also be called your zeros, your solutions, or your roots. So you need to get used to hearing all four of these terms, and they mean the exact same thing. We're also still talking about standard forms, so just remember ax squared plus bx plus c, but instead of y equals, now we're going to have equals 0. You should always have 0 here. If not, you're going to have to move things around. The first thing we're going to look at is solving by graphing, and this is going to be really easy for you because all you have to do is graph just like we've been doing in Chapter 9, Part 1. But then once you've graphed it, you just look at your x-axis and find your x-intercepts. So I'm going to go through example 1 very, very quickly because you should be pretty comfortable with graphing this by now. There's no b here. We have just a c. That means that you know your vertex is going to be 0, 4. Axis of symmetry is x equals 0. Range, everything is going to be greater than or equal to the, to negative 4, because it's opening up. So it should be a negative 4, sorry about that, I wasn't really looking closely. Now, you set up your t-chart, plug in two values that are greater, two values that are less, so we could do 1, -1, 2, -2. Again, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. You get 1 squared subtracting 4, which is a -3, and you know you have the same here. 2 squared is 4, 4 subtracting 4 is 0. And you go plot these points. So we're starting at the point 0, -4, and then we have 1, -3, -1, -3, 2, 0, and -2, 0. We actually ended up finding our x-intercepts while we were plugging things into our t-chart. Now you solve, and when you solve, your answer is basically just wherever your parabola crossed the x-axis. And we talked about this with the discriminant because sometimes it's going to cross twice, sometimes it will only cross once when it starts on there, and sometimes it won't ever cross. So in this case we have two solutions, and our two solutions are, so you can say the x-intercepts or the zeros or the roots. The roots are 2 and -2. Make sure you do not put those as a point because it's not an x and a y, it's two values of x. If you were going to write this as a point, you could write it, I'll just put it right here, or 2, 0, and -2, 0. So if you're writing them as a point, they need to be that way. That's all you're doing every time they ask you to do this, and you're either going to end up with 2, 1, or no solutions. This is example 2. Go ahead and copy this down after I explain it, and then hit play when you're ready. The second way you're going to learn how to solve these or find the roots or the x-intercepts is using square root. The key to this, you can only use this way when there's no b, and you'll see why as we go through all of these. So remember, tonight you're never going to see a b when you're asked to solve by using the square root. You can only have an a or an a and a c. And all you're going to do is isolate x squared just like you used to isolate x in equations. And then once you've isolated x squared, you just take the square root of both sides, and then we're going to go back to talking about what we reviewed in class a little bit, where that could have been a negative number at the beginning because when it got squared it would have disappeared. So we have the plus or minus to our solution. You should have all of this written down now, and we're just going to go through it. So we're going to isolate x squared, add 98 to both sides. We end up with 2x squared equals 98. Divide both sides by 2. And we have x squared equals 49. And now you're going to use, to get rid of this x squared, the opposite here would be to take the square root of it. And when we take the square root of x squared, we get x. And that's what we're solving for, is just x. So that's the way that you get rid of that x squared. And I'm going to go ahead, what you can do in your homework is start just putting it over both right away. But for the example, so you see how we did that, you basically have your x squared equals 49. And then you're going to take square root of this side and square root of this side, and when you do, you need a plus or a minus with the solution side. So now the square root of x squared is x equals plus or minus the square root of 49 is 7. And these aren't always going to be perfect squares. If they're not perfect squares, the homework kind of goes back and forth between allowing you to calculate it out in your calculator and get a decimal, or they just leave it as a perfect square, or as a square root. So you can do both. You can do either or. But in this case, it was a perfect square, and that's our answer. So our solutions here are 7 or -7. And again, that's your x-intercept. If we were looking at a graph, this would be a point on the graph at 7 and a point on the graph at -7 on your x-axis.